Welcome to the Mystery Archive. This is the home of forgotten stories, unexplained events, and, well, the strangest anomalies that history left behind. Imagine a Roman scribe in 150 CE, laboriously copying the same manuscript for the 10th consecutive hour. Suddenly he stops. The Latin word et, a word he's written tens of thousands of times, looks utterly wrong. The letters seem foreign, the spelling impossible. He checks other manuscripts. The word is correct, but his brain refuses to recognize it as familiar, or consider a medieval monk in his monastery's chapel, a space where he's prayed daily for 20 years. One morning during matins, the familiar walls feel alien, as if he's stepped into a stranger's sanctuary. These weren't spiritual crises or signs of demonic possession, as contemporaries might have believed. They were experiencing jamais vu, a cognitive phenomenon that has disturbed human consciousness for as long as our species has possessed the neural architecture for recognition and memory. Today we're exploring this unsettling glitch where the known becomes profoundly unknown, and uncovering what ancient experiences of temporal distortion reveal about the timeless machinery of human cognition. The mechanism behind jamais vu involves cognitive overload through repetition, and historical occupations inadvertently created perfect conditions for triggering this phenomenon. Medieval scribes spent entire days copying the same texts, their eyes tracing identical letter formations hundreds of times per page. The repetitive visual and motor patterns would have regularly desensitized their recognition circuits, making familiar words suddenly appear alien and unfamiliar. Historical accounts occasionally mention scribes experiencing confusion about spelling or word forms they had written correctly countless times before, descriptions that align perfectly with jamais vu induced by semantic satiation. Semantic satiation, which is basically the linguistic form of jamais vu, where words lose their meaning through excessive repetition, has likely affected humans since the very dawn of language development. Ancient religious practices often involved chanting the same prayers or mantras for extended periods, sometimes, for hours on end without a pause. Buddhist monks repeating sutras, Christian monastics chanting psalms, Islamic scholars reciting Quranic verses, all of these practices would have regularly brought about semantic satiation. What modern neuroscience now calls temporary neural fatigue, practitioners back then might have interpreted as transcendent states, moments where language itself seemed to dissolve into pure sound, the meaning stripped away by sheer cognitive overload. These experiences weren't really spiritual achievements, but rather predictable neurological responses to excessive repetition. Historical sleep patterns and work conditions actually created environments where jamais vu would have happened more frequently than it does in modern life. Before artificial lighting, human consciousness operated on entirely different rhythms, with segmented sleep patterns and, longer periods spent doing monotonous activity by candlelight or firelight. The combination of fatigue, poor lighting, and repetitive tasks would have just made attentional lapses a lot more common. Folklore across cultures is full of stories that might represent jamais vu experiences, though they were often interpreted through supernatural frameworks. In Japanese tradition, for example, there are tales of familiar places suddenly becoming strange and even dangerous, requiring rituals to restore their proper nature. European folklore, on the other hand, speaks of people being pixie-led or confused by spirits, causing them to lose recognition of familiar paths and landmarks. Historical medical texts show that physicians have long struggled to categorize experiences that actually align with jamais vu. Ancient Greek medical writers described patients who, strangely enough, could no longer recognize familiar objects or people, even though their memory was intact. The Roman physician Galen documented cases where patients experienced odd alterations in perception, where things they knew suddenly appeared foreign. Medieval Islamic physicians like Avicenna wrote about disorders of recognition and familiarity too. These early medical observers were really documenting neurological phenomena without understanding their mechanisms, creating taxonomies of symptoms that included what we now recognize as jamais right alongside other recognition disorders. The connection between jamais and neurological conditions like epilepsy means this phenomenon has probably been observed throughout human history, though interpreted differently across eras. Ancient texts describe seizure disorders with remarkable detail, and some accounts mention perceptual alterations that precede seizures. The auras experienced by people with temporal lobe epilepsy can include intense jamais vu, and historical descriptions of pre-seizure states sometimes mention feelings of strangeness or unfamiliarity with surroundings. What ancient and medieval physicians attributed to imbalances of humours or spiritual disturbances were often neurological events producing genuine alterations in perception and recognition. Ancient philosophers grappled with questions about memory and recognition without access to neuroscience, yet their observations remain surprisingly relevant. Aristotle's treatise on memory and reminiscence explores how memories form and how recall works, noting that memories can become unclear or distorted. While he couldn't identify neural mechanisms, he recognized that memory wasn't a simple storage system but involved complex processes of encoding and retrieval. Jamais demonstrates exactly what Aristotle suspected. Recognition is an active process that can fail even when the memory itself remains intact. The concept of the brain as a predictive organ has ancient philosophical roots. Stoic philosophers propose that the mind constantly anticipates future events based on past experiences, creating expectations that shape perception. Buddhist philosophy developed elaborate models of how mind constructs experience through prediction and interpretation rather than passive reception. These ancient insights align with modern understanding that jamais vu represents moments when predictive models mismatch actual perception. The brain expects a familiar feeling when encountering something known, but if that expected feeling fails to generate, consciousness experiences the known thing as alien and strange. From an evolutionary perspective, the capacity for jamais vu might have provided adaptive advantages to early humans. A cognitive system that, occasionally forces re-evaluation of familiar things, prevents over-reliance on assumptions, and maintains perceptual flexibility. If our ancestors never questioned their recognition of familiar plants, animals, or locations, they might have missed important changes indicating danger or opportunity. The ability to suddenly experience something familiar as if seeing it for the first time allows fresh evaluation, potentially catching details that habituation had rendered invisible. Jamais vu in this view represents not a bug, but a feature that keeps recognition systems from becoming too rigid. Ancient meditative practices show a, sophisticated understanding of how consciousness constructs familiarity. Buddhist meditation techniques specifically target the feeling of familiarity, encouraging practitioners to observe how recognition and meaning arise in consciousness. Advanced meditation can deliberately induce states resembling jamais vu, where practitioners report that familiar concepts, words, or even their sense of self become strange and unfamiliar. These traditions recognized something modern neuroscience confirms. The feeling of familiarity is constructed moment by moment, not an inherent property of things themselves. Meditation practices that disrupt this construction demonstrate, really, the human capacity for manipulating recognition processes voluntarily. The historical record suggests that jamais vu has been part of human experience since our cognitive architecture developed its current form. What has changed isn't the phenomenon itself, but our framework for understanding it. Ancient peoples attributed these experiences to spiritual forces, possession, divine intervention, or medical imbalances. Medieval scholars place them within humoral theory or theological frameworks. Modern neuroscience identifies them as temporary coordination failures between memory systems. Yet the subjective experience remains identical across millennia, that profoundly unsettling moment when something intimately familiar becomes utterly foreign. Understanding Jamais Vu's historical presence contextualizes it as a fundamental aspect of human consciousness rather than a modern psychological curiosity. Our ancestors experienced these same cognitive glitches, probably with similar frequency, but lacked the explanatory frameworks to recognize them as neurological phenomena. Their supernatural interpretations weren't foolish, given available knowledge. They were reasonable attempts to explain genuinely strange experiences using the conceptual tools their cultures provided. We benefit from neuroscience that can map the mechanisms, but the experience itself connects us directly to every human who has ever stared at a familiar word and wondered if they've suddenly forgotten their own language. The next time you experience Jamais Vu, you're participating in a phenomenon that has disturbed and fascinated humans throughout history. Roman scribes, medieval monks, Enlightenment philosophers, and Victorian writers all confronted this same unsettling cognitive glitch. They described it in their own terms, interpreted it through their cultural frameworks, but felt the same fundamental disturbance: the known becoming unknown, reality flickering between familiar and foreign. This shared experience across time reveals something profound about the consistency of human consciousness. Our technology changes, our understanding deepens, but the basic architecture of mind that produces Jamais Vu has remained remarkably stable across thousands of years of human history. If this exploration of how an ancient cognitive phenomenon has haunted human consciousness throughout history has intrigued you, subscribe to the Mystery Archive for more investigations into the timeless mysteries of mind and perception that connect us to our ancestors. Share this with anyone fascinated by how modern neuroscience illuminates experiences that have puzzled humanity since we first developed the capacity for self-reflection.